So, real quick, I want to ask you something. If I were to ask you to describe what a deluxe Fender amp sounded like, what would you say? Would it sound something like this? Or something more like this? Okay, but what if I ask that same question about, let's say, a hand-wired Vox AC30? Would it sound something like this? Or would it sound more like this? Now, both of these are legendary for a reason, right? I mean, they're two of the most sought after and popular guitar amps of all time. So much so that people have spent literal years trying to recreate them. Well, in fact, the tones that you just heard, well, they were actually recreations coming from pedals rather than actual tube amps. Now, amp modelers have actually been around for a lot longer than most people think. So when was the first digital amp modeler actually invented?
The first digital amp modeler was developed by Line 6 with the release of the Axis 212 in 1996.
But I feel like it's really only been in the past 10 years that guitar players on a much more mainstream basis have really come to accept them as more viable alternatives to tube amps. And a large part of that being due to them not just sounding more like tube amps, but actually starting to react a little bit more like actual amps when being played out of like speakers or headphones. Now with innovations like these tend to come a couple different factors that seem to vary from unit to unit. Size, price, features, but even amongst all of those differences, once I began to really sink my teeth into this world, I started to notice a couple patterns. Now, these weren't necessarily bad, they were just particular trends that I began to notice over and over again, especially with all of the modelers that didn't label themselves as like all-in-one. And of all of those trends, none were more prevalent than the actual style of amps that companies would choose to model. Whether it be Black Star, Strymon, or Walrus, whenever they would come out with their new pedal, amp options on that specific pedal would always be some variation of Fender, Vox, or Marshall, and I'm not talking Ericsson. Now, in the grand scheme of things, like we were talking about before, that makes sense, right? They're the most popular brands of amps for a reason. But the more I actually started to really think about the overall direction that digital amps seemed to be taking, what made sense to me more and more over time was that we were eventually going to start to see some of the bigger names in the modeling game actually take a shift towards more niche amps, if you can even call them that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we actually get this. Now, calling a Dumble a niche amp might be considered a stretch for some people. I mean, its popularity in terms of all-time status is pretty much undeniable. However, when it comes to accessibility, niche doesn't even begin to describe the Dumble, with a legit one probably costing more than most new cars depending on the build. And that's led quite a few people, myself included, to the point where you're chasing that all-elusive Dumble tone. I mean, anyone who's ever spammed Pride and Joy or slow dancing in a guitar store on a Saturday morning is essentially screaming to the heavens that in some form they're seeking that Dumble sound, and that's backed by over 50 years of history. I mean, Howard Dumble originally released his Explosion in 1969. But how in fact does that lead us to right here? Well, you see, the Dumble isn't just one amp like Fender, Vox, Marshall. There are multiple units, there are multiple iterations, with none arguably more prevalent than the Overdrive Special, which happens to be, well, the amp that this pedal is modeling. You see, when I first took this thing out of the box, I was struggling to find out why that even mattered or what would even make this thing different from any of the other Dumble recreations that I've played over the years. But the more I started to actually look into it, it actually started to make a bit more sense to me. You see, because like with about 99.73% of the amps or amp pedals that I usually try, the first thing that I wanted to see was the clean tone. And don't get me wrong, I really liked the tones that I was hearing and I was getting out of this thing, but one of the things that I noticed instantly was even on the jazz setting on the pedal, which it has a jazz and a rock setting, I really had to play with the volume knob if I wanted to get like some of those sparkling cleans that I was used to out of some of the old Dumble recreations that I'd used. Like the specific way that it was breaking up was just a little bit different than what I had expected from a Dumble style pedal. Now, that's when I started to really be curious and I started researching more of the history behind like the Overdrive Special, and I found that in the world of Dumbles, the one that I had been used to like hearing recreations of was actually the Steel String Singer, which is known for being more of like the hyper clean thing in the Overdrive Special, as I probably should have presumed from the name, not saying that it can't get some of the most beautiful clean tones you've ever heard, but it's really known for, well, the overdrive. And that's when I started to toggle to the app and I was thinking to myself, okay, if this is the Overdrive Special, let's really see what it can do. And I went for more of the fed input for just a little bit more gain, played with the volume, played with the overdrive, and I was like, let's get some rock going. And the more I started to play with some of these tones, the biggest thing that actually began to change was my actual perception on some of these settings. It meant for me thinking that the jazz and the rock settings were more about gain, and now me thinking that they're more about like stylistic preferences when it comes to the tone. Like, I'm not necessarily sure if there's an actual gain boost with the rock setting, but I ended up liking the rock clean just as much as I liked the jazz clean, at least in 99.73% of cases. At the end of the day, what final thoughts can we even piece together? And I think the biggest one is to say this. A lot of times I forget that much like with Fender not having just one amp, they have multiple iterations. Even less mainstream brands like a Dumble, it's not just one Dumble, there are multiple iterations, and even if I've played something like a Steel String Singer before, picking up the next Dumble might not sound or react exactly the same. And that should be obvious, but I forget it because I always just think Dumble. And when I start to think about that in the context of digital amps as a whole, one of the things that I'm consistently reminded of is the fact that companies that already have released like amp model or pedals, well, they have their mainstream thing, and that's not going to change. But when it comes to newer units or like the possibility of software updates, we're clearly going to start to get more of these less mainstream models. Like, even if they aren't necessarily the style of amp that is the most versatile and for every single sound, like a Dumble, where it really is for more of a defined specific tone. And I even see Universal Audio step into that realm with like the PV5150 model of this. But I don't know, I'm just really curious to see how deep in that realm the rabbit hole will actually go. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know. What do you think about the idea of digital amps and the specific amps that they're modeling getting less mainstream? What do you think about digital amps as a whole or about the UA Enigmatic? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. It was really cool to check this thing out, especially as like an amp model or defender. Just being able to go outside the box a little bit, even in that same realm of like digital amps and amp modelers as a whole. But if you want to know anything more at all about the UA Enigmatic, I got it from the homies at Sweetwater. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do. Or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I use in this video, pedals, amps, anything, make sure to check out those links. Also, an extra special thank you to all of my patrons. There's some extra exclusive content on there if you want to check it out or join the community. Like and subscribe if you had a good time. And most importantly, like most important of all, have a fantastic night.